Abandoned and blind, the horse had lost all hope. He stood alone in the corner of a neglected paddock, cloaked in silence and surrounded by shadows. Once proud and strong, he was now just a whisper of his former self. His name was Shadow, a tragically fitting name given his sightless world. His life had become nothing but endless darkness. After an accident left him blind, he was deemed useless and left behind by the farm's previous owner. Scraps of hay tossed over the fence were his only sustenance. Days blurred into weeks, and Shadow's vibrant spirit slowly faded. His ribs pressed against his dull coat. His movements were slow and hesitant. With each cautious step, his body bore the weight of loneliness and despair. Not far from the paddock, a small orange tabby cat named Jasper roamed the overgrown farmyard. Jasper was fearless, sharp, and resilient. He had survived the farm's neglect with keen instincts and an independent streak, but even he longed for a connection. In his golden eyes flickered the need for something more than just survival. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jasper heard a soft, sorrowful whinny. His ears perked. Driven by curiosity, he padded silently through the tall grass toward the sound. At the edge of the paddock, he paused, peering through the wooden rails. There stood Shadow, frail and still, his head bowed low and his eyes clouded with blindness. The sight stirred something in Jasper. He leapt gracefully onto a fence post, watching intently. Shadow's condition shocked him. His frame emaciated, his coat dull, his presence almost ghostly. Yet, it was the hollow emptiness in Shadow's eyes that captured Jasper's heart. For a moment, Jasper hesitated. Then, with quiet determination, he jumped from the post and landed softly inside the paddock. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound. His head lifted slightly, uncertain. Jasper moved closer, dwarfed by the horse towering above him. He let out a soft meow that echoed gently through the space. Shadow flinched. He hadn't heard another creature in weeks. Jasper sat a few feet away, his tail curled neatly around his paws, his gaze steady and calm. He meowed again, this time softer, like a whisper inviting trust. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Shadow took a step forward. That one step, though shaky and small, marked a turning point. Shadow, frail, blind, and forgotten, edged closer to the unfamiliar sound that called to him through the silence. Jasper didn't flinch. He remained seated, calm and grounded, his presence more comforting than words. As the wind rustled through the trees, Shadow's nose brushed against the air near Jasper, catching the faint scent of the little cat. It was not the scent of fear or threat. It was of life, of something present and warm. Jasper meowed once more. His body language was soft, relaxed. His tail flicked gently, signaling peace. That night, something shifted inside the forgotten paddock. For weeks, Shadow had stood motionless, isolated by fear and darkness. But now, guided by Jasper's tiny voice and quiet confidence, he began to explore, one cautious step at a time. Jasper walked beside him, weaving around his hooves like a flame lighting the path forward. Together, they moved through the paddock's overgrown grass as if discovering it anew. By dawn, Shadow stood near the center of the paddock, his head slightly raised, listening. Jasper lay curled at his feet, purring steadily, a small sentinel who refused to leave his side. It was the beginning of something profound. Their bond was fragile but undeniable, a silent agreement between two beings abandoned in different ways, yet both desperate for connection. They had no words, no promises, just shared presence. Each day, Jasper became more than a companion. He became a guide. He meowed when it was time to walk, purred when it was time to rest, and brushed his body gently against Shadow's legs to signal changes in direction. The blind horse, who had once stood trembling in place, now followed Jasper's cues with surprising trust. Shadow's movements, once hesitant and weak, grew steadier with each passing day. The rhythm of Jasper's small footsteps created a pattern Shadow instinctively followed, a beat that cut through the silence of his world. And so, in the forgotten corner of a quiet farm, under the gray sky and tall grass, a cat and a horse, one blind, the other tiny, began to rebuild what life had tried to take away. Hope. The sun rose slowly over the fields, casting long shadows across the farm. Inside the weathered old house nearby, an elderly woman named Margaret sat by her window, a warm cup of tea cradled in her trembling hands. Her eyes, dulled by age but still alert, were drawn once again to the paddock, where something curious had been happening. She had owned the land for decades. Once, it was full of life and laughter, horses and riders, children and hope. But as her health declined, so too had the farm. The buildings weathered, the fences sagged, and the fields grew wild. Shadow had been left behind after an injury. Margaret, overwhelmed and heartbroken, hadn't had the strength to care for him properly. She believed he had given up, just as she had. But now something had changed. Each morning, she noticed the little cat, Jasper, moving with purpose, always beside the horse she had long thought beyond saving. Margaret watched as the tabby meowed, circled, and guided Shadow around the paddock. It was subtle but undeniable. Shadow was moving again, drinking water, finding shelter, reacting to the world. That morning, she noticed the water trough was nearly empty. Margaret rose with effort and shuffled to the kitchen. She filled a bucket slowly, her joints aching. Then she made her way outside, her boots crunching the gravel path as she approached the paddock for the first time in weeks. As she neared, Jasper noticed her immediately. He darted to the fence, placing himself between her and Shadow, his golden eyes alert and protective. "Easy there, little one," Margaret murmured, her voice gentle. She lowered the bucket beside the trough and began to pour. The splash of fresh water caught Shadow's ears. He lifted his head slowly, his nose searching the air. Jasper gave a soft meow and stepped aside, offering a clear path. Shadow moved forward and lowered his head to drink. Margaret watched with tears in her eyes. It was the first time she had seen him truly drink in days. And it wasn't because of her. It was because of the cat. At that moment, Margaret realized something vital. Shadow hadn't given up. He just needed someone to believe in him. And somehow Jasper, a creature a fraction of his size, had done just that. From that moment on, Margaret took it upon herself to help. Not just Shadow, but the remarkable cat who had never left his side. She cleared debris from the paddock, spread fresh hay, and made sure the water trough was always full. Her steps were slow, her body tired, but her heart had found a renewed sense of purpose. Every day she watched as Shadow grew stronger. His coat, once matted and lifeless, began to regain its shine. His ribs, once painfully visible, started to fill out. Jasper stayed close, leading him with unwavering devotion. Their silent communication became clearer with each passing day. A subtle nod here, a quiet meow there. Shadow followed Jasper not just with his ears, but with his trust. Margaret often sat by the fence, her weathered hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching in quiet awe. "You two are quite the team," she would whisper, her voice full of affection and wonder. Then, one crisp afternoon, something unusual happened. As Margaret brushed Shadow's coat, Jasper darted off toward the barn. His tail flicked with urgency. Moments later, he returned, with something small and shiny clutched in his mouth. A tiny brass bell. He dropped it at Margaret's feet and let out a triumphant meow. She picked it up, puzzled. "What's this, Jasper?" she asked aloud. The cat pawed at the bell, then nudged it toward Shadow. Margaret's brow furrowed as realization slowly dawned. "You want him to follow the sound, don't you?" Her voice trembled with emotion. She retrieved a small piece of ribbon, tied the bell to it, and fastened it gently around Jasper's collar. When the cat moved, the bell gave off a soft, melodic jingle. Shadow's ears twitched instantly, his head turning toward the sound. With Jasper leading and the bell ringing softly, Shadow now had something more than companionship. He had a guide he could follow with confidence. That evening, Margaret stood by the paddock gate as the pair moved together. Jasper trotted ahead, the bell chiming gently, and Shadow followed, his steps sure, his ears fixed on the sound. It was like a dance. A horse who could not see, and a cat who saw for them both. Margaret wiped away a tear as she whispered, "You've given him a second chance, Jasper, and maybe you've given me one too." As the days passed, the farm began to change. Not just in appearance, but in spirit. The once-forgotten paddock now buzzed with quiet life. Shadow, once motionless and broken, now moved confidently across the field, guided by the rhythmic chime of Jasper's bell. With each step, their bond deepened. Margaret watched them with growing wonder. She found herself waking up earlier, tending to the farm with a renewed sense of energy. She no longer saw a dying dream in the cracked fences and overgrown fields. Instead, she saw possibility. One morning, she noticed something different. Jasper was leading Shadow farther than usual, beyond the familiar paddock and toward the edge of the sprawling fields. He would dart ahead, tail high, bell jingling, then pause and look back, waiting patiently for Shadow to catch up. It was as if Jasper was urging him to discover a world that stretched beyond the place of his pain. Margaret stood on the porch, clutching her shawl tightly as she watched. Shadow's steps were slow but determined. His ears swiveled with focus, his nose twitching as he absorbed every scent carried by the breeze. With Jasper by his side, the world no longer seemed so intimidating. "You're teaching him to trust again," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "To believe in what's possible." That evening, after feeding them, she sat by the fireplace flipping through an old photo album. One picture made her pause, a younger Margaret standing beside her late husband, Edward, proudly holding the reins of a strong chestnut stallion. Edward had been a gifted horse trainer, and together they had once run a thriving equestrian program. The farm had been full of laughter, hoofbeats, and dreams. That was a lifetime ago. Since Edward passed, the barn had grown quiet, and Margaret had slowly let go of the legacy they had built. But now there was a spark again. She looked back toward the paddock where Shadow and Jasper rested side by side beneath the stars. "We used to give horses a chance to shine," she murmured. "Maybe it's time to do that again." The next morning, Margaret woke with purpose. For the first time in years, she felt the fire of determination rise in her chest. She put on her boots, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with her old address book. With slightly shaking fingers, she began to make calls. Some numbers no longer worked. Others connected her with old friends, people who had once ridden beside her, trained under Edward, or helped raise foals in the barn. One of those calls changed everything. It was to a local equine therapy center, run by a kind and passionate woman named Helen. Margaret shared Shadow's story: the blindness, the abandonment, the quiet healing, and the cat. She expected a polite dismissal. Instead, there was a pause, then a voice filled with interest and hope. "I'd love to meet them both," Helen said. This might be something special." 3 days later, a dusty pickup truck pulled into the drive. Out stepped Helen, confident, kind-eyed, and curious. She carried no clipboard, just a quiet attentiveness that immediately put Margaret at ease. Together, they walked toward the paddock. What Helen saw stopped her in her tracks. Shadow was standing tall, ears alert, his movements slow but sure as he followed the jingling of Jasper's bell. The little cat paused occasionally, looking back to make sure his companion was near. Their rhythm was like a song only the two of them could hear. "I've seen a lot of horses," Helen said softly, "but never anything quite like this." She spent the afternoon assessing Shadow's physical and emotional state, watching how he moved, how he reacted to sounds, and most importantly, how he trusted Jasper completely. "This cat isn't just a companion," she said to Margaret. "He's a lifeline. Shadow's bond with him is extraordinary, and it might be the very thing that helps him serve others." Helen had a proposal. With Margaret's blessing, Shadow could begin gradual, supervised training at the therapy center. His calm nature, growing confidence, and deep trust in Jasper made him a promising candidate for equine-assisted therapy, particularly with children or individuals with visual impairments or emotional trauma. Margaret's eyes welled with tears as she listened. The thought of Shadow helping others the way Jasper had helped him It felt like a full circle, like Edward was smiling somewhere just beyond the clouds. That night, Margaret sat in the barn as Shadow rested and Jasper purred beside him. "You're ready," she whispered into the stillness. "And I think so am I." The morning air was crisp and still as Helen's trailer pulled into the gravel drive. Margaret stood near the paddock gate, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had barely slept the night before. This wasn't just a goodbye, it was a leap of faith. Shadow stood beside Jasper, ears flicking at the unfamiliar rumble of the vehicle. The bell on Jasper's collar jingled softly, a quiet reassurance. Helen stepped out of the truck with her usual calm confidence. "Are you ready, Shadow?" she asked gently, looking into his clouded eyes. Margaret gave a soft smile. "He's come so far. I hope this is the right step." Helen placed a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder. "You've given him everything he needed to reach this moment. Now, let's see how far he can go." Loading Shadow into the trailer was delicate. Margaret held her breath as Jasper trotted up the ramp first, the bell ringing in steady rhythm. Shadow hesitated at the base. His large hooves clattered against the metal ramp, but Jasper's presence was all he needed. With slow, measured steps, Shadow climbed inside. He stood quietly once inside, his breathing calm, his ears tuned only to the bell and the cat. Margaret stood at the edge of the road, watching the trailer disappear into the horizon. Her heart felt heavy and light at once, an ache wrapped in pride. For months, Shadow and Jasper had been her companions, her purpose. But she knew this wasn't the end. It was a beginning. The therapy center was a beautiful place. Rolling fields framed by towering oaks, white fences gleaming in the sunlight. When they arrived, Helen led them to a spacious paddock where Shadow could adjust slowly. Jasper, ever vigilant, never strayed far. The staff observed in fascination as the blind horse followed the cat with remarkable ease. Wherever Jasper went, Shadow was close behind. Whether it was over soft grass, past low fences, or around corners, Shadow trusted every step guided by that gentle bell. Helen and her team began working with them immediately. They introduced new sounds, textures, and pathways. They placed light obstacles on the ground and encouraged Shadow to explore, always with Jasper leading the way. Shadow adapted quickly. The fear that had once clouded every movement was replaced by curiosity and calm. He learned to respond to voice cues. He walked through obstacle courses. He stood quietly as children approached. And Jasper, small, fierce Jasper, became a legend at the center. Weeks passed at the therapy center, and Shadow's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. Once hesitant and broken, he now moved with purpose. Though he couldn't see, his trust in Jasper and his growing confidence gave him new strength each day. The staff adored him. Children visiting the center often asked about the big horse with the little cat. Jasper, always a few steps ahead or curled beside Shadow's feet, had won their hearts with his bold spirit and gentle loyalty. Then came the day of Shadow's first real test. Helen wanted to evaluate his progress with a more structured challenge. In the arena, she arranged a simple course: poles on the ground, cones to guide his steps, and soft ramps to navigate. Jasper trotted to the start of the path, the small bell on his collar chiming clearly through the quiet. Shadow followed, pausing at the first pole. He hesitated. His ears twitched, listening. Jasper looked back, gave a firm meow, then jingled the bell again. Shadow's ears swiveled, and after a breathless pause, he stepped over the pole. Then another, and another. With each soft jingle, he moved forward, steadier, stronger, more certain. The watching staff held their breath, then erupted in quiet applause as Shadow completed the course. Helen wiped a tear from her cheek. "He's incredible," she said softly. "And what they have, it's more than training. It's trust in its purest form." From that day on, Shadow began participating in guided therapy sessions. He interacted gently with children who were nervous around animals. He stood patiently as they reached out to touch his neck, his calm presence easing their fears. Jasper remained his constant companion, always nearby, always alert. Margaret visited often, Each time she saw Shadow, her heart swelled with pride. She would sit by the fence and watch as he moved with grace, guided not by sight, but by faith. One afternoon, she watched as Shadow gently lowered his head toward a young girl in a wheelchair. She giggled as his warm breath tickled her fingers. Tears filled Margaret's eyes. "You've done so much more than I ever dreamed," she whispered to him. Shadow had gone from abandoned to adored, from forgotten to a source of healing. And Jasper, with his tiny body and enormous heart, had led the way. The therapy center buzzed with excitement. Helen and her team had decided to host an open house, a special event to showcase the transformative power of equine therapy. Families, therapists, and animal lovers from the community were invited. And at the heart of it all stood Shadow and Jasper. They would be the stars. Helen spent days preparing a presentation, filled with photos and video clips chronicling Shadow's incredible journey. From his first shaky steps in the overgrown paddock to confidently guiding children through therapy sessions, his transformation was breathtaking. Jasper's role, his loyalty, his bravery was celebrated just as deeply. When the big day arrived, the center overflowed with visitors. Children clutched their parents' hands. Therapists mingled with supporters and curious newcomers. A sense of joy and wonder filled the air. Margaret stood near the edge of the arena, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't been in front of a crowd in years. Yet as Helen took the microphone, Margaret felt nothing but pride. "Today," Helen began, "we celebrate resilience, healing, and the unexpected beauty of connection." Behind her, a large screen lit up with Shadow's story. Images of him, frail and blind, alone in a paddock, flashed on the screen. Then came the photos of Jasper, standing protectively at his side, guiding him through obstacles and napping together in the sun. Murmurs of awe rippled through the crowd. Some wiped away tears. Others stood in quiet reverence. Then it was time. Helen stepped aside as Shadow and Jasper entered the arena. The bell jingled gently. Shadow followed with quiet confidence. Together, they moved through the course. Poles, cones, ramps. Every step guided by the soft chime and the cat he trusted with his life. The crowd was silent. And when they finished, the applause erupted loud, joyful, emotional. After the performance, families were invited to meet them. Children approached cautiously at first. Shadow stood calm and unbothered, lowering his head so tiny hands could touch his mane. Jasper, ever the charmer, rubbed against their legs, his purr like a lullaby. One boy, sitting in a wheelchair near the edge of the crowd, was gently encouraged by his mother to come forward. With a little guidance, he stretched out his hand. Shadow lowered his head. Their touch was brief, but it changed something. The boy smiled. His mother sobbed quietly, holding his shoulders. Margaret watched, her heart aching with joy. "They're more than just a horse and a cat," Helen whispered beside her. "They're proof of what's possible, when we don't give up." And in that moment, Margaret knew Shadow and Jasper's journey had only just begun. The open house was a resounding success. That night, as the sun dipped low and the lights in the barn flickered on, Margaret sat beside Shadow's stall. Jasper lay curled at the horse's feet, purring softly, his bell silent for the moment. Margaret gently stroked Shadow's mane, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've shown them what second chances look like," she said. "And you've given me mine too." But the story wasn't just touching those in the therapy center. A local reporter who had attended the open house was deeply moved. She approached Margaret afterward, microphone in hand and eyes shining. "People need to hear about this," she said. "It's a story the world could use right now." Margaret hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. Within days, the interview aired on the local evening news. It featured footage of Shadow navigating the course with Jasper, clips of children smiling as they touched his coat, and Margaret's heartfelt narration about the journey from despair to healing. The story spread like wildfire. People from neighboring towns and soon from across the country began reaching out. Social media lit up with photos, messages of hope, and personal reflections. Animal lovers, parents of children with disabilities, veterans struggling with trauma. All found inspiration in Shadow and Jasper's bond. Messages poured in. Your story reminded me to keep going. We adopted an older cat today because of Jasper. My son watched the video 3 times. He wants to meet Shadow someday. And then came a letter that Margaret would never forget. It was from a woman named Emily, who had been battling depression after losing her job. I felt like I had no value, the letter read. But watching Shadow blind, abandoned, and seeing how he rose again, with help, gave me something I hadn't felt in years: hope. Thank you. Thank you for sharing him with us. Margaret wiped tears from her cheeks as she read it aloud to Shadow. You're changing lives, old boy. You and that fearless little cat. That evening, as stars blinked awake in the sky above the farm, Margaret understood something profound. This wasn't just a personal story anymore. It had become a movement, and it had only just begun. It was a quiet afternoon when the phone rang in Margaret's kitchen. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and answered, expecting another local reporter or therapy center volunteer. But the voice on the other end was different. Confident, professional, and filled with excitement. Hi, this is Rachel Summers from Heartline Television Network. We've seen the story of Shadow and Jasper, and we'd like to feature them in a national documentary about the healing power of animals. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She looked out the window toward the paddock, where Shadow grazed peacefully and Jasper lay sunbathing on a fence post. After a long pause, she replied softly, yes, they deserve to be seen. Preparations began quickly. A film crew arrived at the therapy center and the farm. They spent days capturing every moment. The routines, the interactions, the silent communication between cat and horse, and the bond that had turned tragedy into triumph. They filmed Shadow navigating complex courses with Jasper leading the way. They captured children giggling as they touched his velvet nose, Jasper weaving between their legs like a tiny guardian. They filmed Margaret telling their story with a trembling voice and eyes full of pride. One moment stood out above all others. Shadow stood in a sunlit pasture, his head lifted, ears tuned to the wind. On the fence post above him, Jasper sat proudly, the bell around his neck gleaming in the golden light. They didn't move. They didn't need to. The camera zoomed in slowly, capturing the silence, the trust, the unspoken unity. When the documentary aired nationwide, the response was overwhelming. Emails, letters, donations, and personal stories flooded in. Viewers shared how Shadow and Jasper had reignited their faith, inspired them to adopt rescues, and reminded them that healing is always possible, even in the darkest circumstances. Animal welfare groups and equine therapy advocates reached out. Invitations poured in for Shadow and Jasper to appear at events, conferences, and awareness campaigns. They had become more than a story. They had become symbols. At one of those events, in front of a large crowd of animal lovers and therapy professionals, Margaret stood on stage beside Helen, Shadow, and Jasper. She clutched the microphone with both hands, her voice steady. When I first found Shadow, I thought he was beyond saving. And maybe so was I. But this little cat, he changed everything. Together they taught me, and the world, that no soul is ever too far gone. Not when there's love. Not when there's hope. The crowd erupted in applause. And as it echoed through the air, Shadow lifted his head. His ears turned toward the sound. On his back, perched like a tiny crown, sat Jasper. His bell ringing gently, his eyes calm. In that moment, they weren't just a horse and a cat. They were a message, a reminder that even the most broken beings can become a beacon of light. Life at the farm settled into a new rhythm. Though Shadow and Jasper traveled often to speak for causes they could never voice in words, the farm remained their sanctuary, the place where everything began. Every time they returned, Margaret would be waiting by the gate, arms open, heart full. Shadow was no longer the frail, blind horse standing in silence. He now walked with strength, head held high, ears tuned to Jasper's bell and the world around him. Jasper, though small in stature, had grown into a legend, a guide, a protector, and the heart of every room he entered. Their story continued to spread. Schools requested virtual visits. Therapists wrote papers on their bond. Animal shelters saw a rise in adoptions. Letters came from all over the world, from soldiers, grieving mothers, children in recovery, and elderly men who hadn't smiled in years, until Shadow and Jasper. They had become more than a pair of unlikely friends. They had become hope incarnate. One evening, just as the sun painted the horizon in streaks of orange and rose, Margaret stood by the paddock with a warm blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The breeze carried the familiar jingle of Jasper's bell and the steady thud of hooves. Shadow and Jasper were walking the fence line, just as they had done in the early days. But now, their movements were not hesitant, not uncertain. They were confident, purposeful, free. Margaret smiled through misty eyes. "You've changed the world," she whispered. "You've changed me." As the stars emerged one by one, the two friends stood still under the sky, one blind but never lost, the other small but fiercely devoted. Together, they had taken what was broken and turned it into something beautiful. A boy once wrote to Margaret, "If Shadow can do it, so can I." And that was the heart of it all. Shadow and Jasper proved that no matter how far you've fallen, no matter how dark it gets, healing is possible. That love, pure, persistent love, can rebuild what was once shattered. And that sometimes, the light we need most comes from the most unexpected places. A forgotten horse, a fearless cat, and the woman who never stopped believing in second chances. Their journey had begun in silence and sorrow, but it would echo in hearts for generations. And somewhere, in the twilight, where bells chime gently and hooves tread softly, hope still walks, guided by a cat named Jasper, beside a horse who learned to believe again.